Well, hello everyone. We are in the home stretch here. Today we are going to start with chapter 13, finish it on Wednesday, and then there's just one chapter to go. So, getting close. And you all signed up for an Intro to Business course, so sooner or later we are going to be talking about money. And today is the day we're going to be talking about it. All right, our chapter is on managing financial resources, and that's going to start with money. So if you're waiting for this, here you go. But first, we're going to take a look at what we have coming up. All right, so as usual, let's see what we have. Chapter 13 quiz is this Friday at midnight, and then your final interim submission on finance and administration is due Wednesday at midnight. So once that's knocked out, then you'll just finish up with the business plan and the slides. So getting close here too. Okay. So that's what we have coming up. Let's move into chapter 13. Boy, look at that. Money is still falling here. Must have had a lot. Well, I know a lot of you are interested in the stock market and investing. Well, this chapter is on the financial system as a whole. And we're going to get to stocks and investing a little bit on Wednesday. Today, more about money and how the system works, how the financial system works, and at times how it doesn't work. We're going to look at that too today, how at times the system can not work. So let's look at our learning objectives, and here they are. Today we'll be looking at the learning objectives here on the left-hand side, and then on Wednesday we'll move over to those on the right-hand side. And as you know, we like to start our chapters with a question. And so let's look at the question we're going to open today's chapter with. There it is. What's the purpose of money? Hint, there are three of them. There are three of them. Give that some thought, and then we'll tell you what they are. All right, let's talk about the functions of money. So, function number one, it serves as a medium of exchange. What's that mean? It simply means you can use money to buy stuff. People will accept it. And there are four components of that why people will accept it. One, it's divisible, right? There's lots of different amounts or denominations of money. $1 bill, $5 bill, quarter, nickel, dime. Divisible. Secondly, it's portable, which means it's easy to carry around. Third, it's durable, right? Coins, pretty durable. The bills, relatively hard to tear, hard to smear, etc. And then finally, difficult to counterfeit. Have to have that too. So, people can't just make up money. So those are the four components of a medium of exchange, okay? Secondly, it's a measure of value. Things are measured in money, right? We don't barter. Things are measured in money. Finally, it's a store of value. People are willing to hold it. They're willing to store it. They're willing to invest it, okay, because there's confidence in it. So those are the three basic functions of money. Medium of exchange, measure of value, and store of value. So if that's money's functions, how do we measure it? Well, two main ways to measure money. One is called M1 and one is M2. Here's the difference. M1 is the most liquid form of money. Okay? It's money that's in circulation, money in checking accounts, money in travelers' accounts. Because all of that you can give to someone in exchange for something, right? You can give them money or you can write them a check and they'll give you something back. So it's the most liquid form called M1. M2 is the second most liquid form because generally there's a step between this type of money and actually being able to buy something. So things like savings accounts. If you have money in a savings account, it has to go into your checking before you're able to use it to buy something. money market mutual funds, CDs, time deposits. We're going to talk about all of those on Wednesday. But in each case, you have to redeem those things in order to have the money to buy something. So M2 is essentially a step removed from money you're able to immediately exchange. M1 and M2 are the two ways we measure money. So how much of it is out there? We need to know that, right? Well, let's take a look. How much money is out there? So the Fed, our friends of the Federal Reserve that we've talked about before, and we're going to talk about later today, they measure it. And let's see, this is as of April 9th. And so as of April 9th, in M1, we have about $4 trillion today. M2, which is just includes everything in M1, plus those other deposits, there's about $15.5 trillion. So there you have it. The Fed measures how much money is out there, and they measure it in terms of M1 and M2. And there's the definitions of M1 and M2 we just went over. So, if that's the functions of money and how we measure it, well, let's talk about how money moves through the system. And it does so through the use of financial intermediaries. Financial intermediaries. And the most common one that you're familiar with are banks. Banks. So let's talk about how the system works. First, how do banks make money? How do banks make money? Well, mostly it's through an interest rate spread. Essentially, they take deposits from you and businesses. They hardly pay you anything in interest, right? It's way under 1% what you get. If you look at your monthly statements, you probably get pennies every month. Well, banks take those deposits and then they make loans. Also to you and to businesses. Loans for houses, cars, student loans, personal loans, business loans. All those loans are loaned out at a higher interest rate than they're paying you on the deposits. That's how they make their money. On the spread between what they're paying you, very little in interest, and the amount of interest they're charging for these loans. And so that's how money moves through the system with banks. Okay? You and businesses deposit your money in the banks. They then loan it to you and businesses as borrowers at a higher rate. You pay the banks back, and then they pay you back, and they keep the difference. Okay? That's the role of financial intermediaries. But there's a number of different intermediaries, not just banks. And we're going to talk about some of them today. So, there's really two main types of financial intermediaries, as you see there. There's depository institutions and non-depository. And we're going to talk about each in turn. But let's start with the difference. Depository institutions literally accept deposits that customers can withdraw on demand. Customers can withdraw their money whenever they want to. Excuse me. So, when you put your money in either a bank or a credit union, and we're going to talk about the differences, anytime you'd like, you can write a check, you can go to bill pay, you can go to any of your apps, you can take that money out. No problem. You deposit it and you can withdraw on demand with a depository institution. Not so with a non-depository institution. They don't accept deposits and they don't offer checking accounts. We'll talk about them secondly. But they also serve the role of financial intermediaries between savers and borrowers. These are the institutions that make the financial system work. So let's start by looking at depository institutions. Commercial banks are the largest of the group by far, and they're the most important institution in the U.S. because so many people use them. Okay? The overwhelming majority of you probably have your money in a commercial bank. Bank of America, Eagle Bank, SunTrust, Wells Fargo, all commercial banks. There's also savings banks, relatively small group. They used to be known as S&Ls, savings and loans, or thrift institutions. And they were originally founded to offer largely mortgages, which are home loans to people. But back in 2008, with the housing crisis, which we'll talk about today, many of them failed. So today, they're really more local institutions and savings banks. Excuse me. And they still largely offer residential mortgages, but they're very similar to commercial banks today. And then finally, credit unions. I'd be interested in how many of you belong to a credit union. That's what they are. Not-for-profit, cooperative institutions owned by their members. Owned by their members. So, if you belong to a credit union, you have to be with a group that has a similar occupation, similar employer, a similar membership. Okay, take a look at the graphic. NIH has a credit union for people that work at NIH. Navy Credit Union is for anybody who works for the Department of Defense. American Airlines has a credit union. United Nations has a credit union. Many big companies have a credit union. We're going to look at one in a second. So these are non-profits, okay? They really exist because they encourage people to invest. That's why they were set up. So people that belong to these groups would be encouraged to invest because it's very convenient to be able to do that at your place of work or your place of membership, okay? They gave loans to people who might have been of ordinary means, and regular banks wouldn't give them loans. So that's really the genesis of credit unions, why they started. And today, people really like them. Because they're nonprofits, generally they charge lower fees, okay, and interest rates. They will charge you lower interest rates as well. So people like them. They're convenient, they have good customer service, and they have low fees, and they'll charge you lower interest rates on loans that you might take out from them. Well, if that's so great, why doesn't everybody join a credit union who could? Well, there's disadvantages as well. Generally speaking, there might be fewer branches and ATMs than a big bank. If you get a credit card from them, there's probably fewer rewards than those offered by a big bank. And typically they'll have fewer overall services because they're smaller. So, like anything else, advantages and disadvantages. Let's take a look at one because I mentioned that some big companies have one. Well, we use Marriott as an example here a bit, and look at this. Marriott has their own credit union. So if you belong to Marriott, if you've worked there, you can join their credit union. And see, it's set up just like a regular bank. Online banking, mobile banking, okay? Here's all their services, just like a bank. Very similar to a bank. And very attractive, competitive fees because they are a nonprofit. And look, they're based in Bethesda. We know their headquarters is in Bethesda. And keep an eye on this because we're going to talk about this next. Federally insured by NCUA. Okay, so one of the good things about depository institutions is that they are insured. They're insured. You may have heard of the term FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And this goes back to 1933. Now, what was happening in 1933? Yep, the Great Depression. And what happened before FDIC was instituted was there were runs on banks. Okay? If people heard, hey, I heard this bank might be going under, what would they do? What would be the logical thing to do if you heard that before there was insurance? You would literally run to that bank to take your money out. And so banks were failing just based on rumors and because people were afraid. And so the federal government set up FDIC, insurance on qualifying accounts. So if a bank fails today, you are insured up to $250,000 for each qualifying account. Well, what qualifies? Let's take a look. Here's the FDIC homepage. Okay, and it says FDIC insurance covers all deposit accounts, checking, savings, money market, and CDs. So basically, if you deposit your money, it's covered. It's not going to cover things like what? Stocks and bonds and life insurance, annuities. There's risk associated with all that. The government can't cover that. They can't cover that type of risk. Okay, so it's just money you deposit that's covered by the FDIC. And it's per person, per bank, per account. So if you have a checking account, $250. Savings account, $250. Money market account, $250. If you're in multiple banks, it's $250,000 for each of those. And as it says, no depositor has ever lost anything in an FDIC insured account. So, it's $250,000 for each account today. It used to be $100,000. Can you guess why it went up to $250,000? Well, it goes back to the housing crisis in 2008, and we're going to be talking about that today. It used to be $100,000 per account, and it went up to $250,000. So, if the FDIC insures commercial and savings banks, how about credit unions? Does it insure them? And the answer is no, it doesn't. But as I showed you on the Marriott page, there's another federal agency that insures them. Okay, it's called the National Credit Union Association. It's essentially very similar to the FDIC. It also insures deposit accounts up to $250,000. And if you want to see if your bank is FDIC insured, well, you can check. And let's take a look and see. It's not required that your bank be FDIC insured. But effectively, if it isn't, you can't really compete, because who'd want to put their money in a bank that isn't insured? So effectively, all banks you've heard of are FDIC insured. And we mentioned Eagle Bank. They're a local bank. This is the FDIC website. Let's take a look and see. Eagle Bank. Well, there we go. Eagle Bank. Active. Bethesda, Maryland headquarters. Okay. They are FDIC insured. Shows their locations. And there you go. Some of you may have your money in Eagle Bank. A couple of Rockville branches on Shady Grove and Twinbrook. But they are FDIC insured. We checked it, and you can check your bank. I'm sure that it'll be FDIC insured. Okay, so that's a little bit about depository institutions. So let's talk about non-depository institutions, because there are also intermediaries, but you don't deposit money with them. There's no checking accounts with them. They accept funds that they then invest. That's how they work. They'll accept your money that they'll invest. So let's talk about each in turn, because I'm sure you're aware of these, or certainly you've heard of these. Certainly insurance companies. Okay? Now, how do insurance companies make money? Well, you might think, well, premiums. They do charge premiums, and that's more than the claims they pay out. Well, in truth, they only make very little from that. They make most of their money from investing the premiums. Just like banks, really. That's where they really make their money. You give them premiums every month to pay for your insurance. They then take that money and invest it in stocks, in bonds, in real estate, and other securities, and that's where they really make their money. As you know, I was in the commercial real estate business, and most of my big clients were insurance companies and pension funds. We're going to talk about pension funds next. They're the groups that own those big buildings in downtown DC, in big cities across the U.S. They're owned largely by institutions like insurance companies and pension funds. So I worked for Prudential, Northwestern Mutual Life, Principal Mutual Life, State Farm, MetLife. You've heard of all those. That's who we work for, and that's how they serve as intermediaries. They take your premiums and they invest it in securities, stocks, bonds, and real estate. Again, pension funds, very similar. What are pension funds? They're essentially retirement funds that are sponsored by employers. You've heard of 401ks. We're going to talk more about those next chapter, why they're good and how you invest in those. 401ks are also retirement plans. Pension funds are those that are sponsored by employers and that are the responsibility of employers. They're a little bit different, okay? In a 401k, you decide how much money to put in. You decide where the money goes. In a pension fund, the employer decides where the money goes. You contribute some. The employer typically contributes more than in a 401k, and it's their responsibility to pay you. So it costs more for an employer to have a pension fund than to set up a 401k. And the pension funds take the money that you invest, and they also buy office buildings and stocks and bonds. So they get a return on that money, so when you do retire, they have the money to pay you. Finance companies, well, as an example, many car companies have finance companies. GM used to be called GMAC, now called GM Financial. So if you go to buy a car, there's a finance company that GM owns that will set up the loan for you. So it's, again, an intermediary. And then finally, mutual funds and ETFs. Again, we'll be talking about those next chapter when we talked about personal finance and why you might want to consider being involved in mutual funds and ETFs. For today, I'm just going to give you an introduction to what they are. Let's start with what a mutual fund is. Essentially, it's just a basket of stocks. That's what a mutual fund is. It's a basket of stocks. Let me give you an example. There's 30 people in our class, and let's say you wanted to buy 50 different stocks, but you only had, say, $1,000. What if our class got together, the 30 of us, and we said, you know what? Let's pool all of our money. Some people can give 1,000, some people can give 2,000, some people can give 5,000. Whatever they want to invest, we'll pool it all together, and then we'll buy a whole bunch of stocks. So we do it. People give either 1 or 2 or 5,000, and we collect, say, $100,000 between the 30 of us. Now we can afford to buy 50 stocks, right? So we go out and we buy, as a group, 50 stocks. Now, if you wanted to invest in Apple and Microsoft, Google, Nike, McDonald's, Netflix, all those, now you can afford to do it because we've pooled our money. So let's say at the end of the year, our investments went up by 10%. We bought $100,000 worth of stocks. At the end of the year, they're worth $110,000. Well, depending on how much you gave at the beginning, that's how much of a return you would get. So if you gave $1,000 up front, we'll give you $100. That's 10%. If you gave $2,000 up front, here's $200, 10% for you. If you gave $5,000 up front, here's $500. That's your 10%. That's what a mutual fund is. They work exactly the same way. Big groups of people put in whatever they want. The mutual fund pools all that money, invests in stocks, and then whatever the return is, they send that percentage back out to the people. A mutual fund is as simple as that, and we'll be talking more about them. Exchange-traded funds work very much the same way. Really, the main difference is that they are traded on an exchange. We'll talk about exchanges on Wednesday. A New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ. Those are exchanges, and that's where ETFs trade, as opposed to mutual funds, which are sponsored by groups like Fidelity or Vanguard. But they're very similar. I'm going to show you a video now. It's only about 4 minutes, a little bit less, that talks a little bit more about the difference between mutual funds and exchange-traded funds. So let's see if we can pull this up.
An exchange-traded fund, or ETF, is an investment fund that trades like a stock. ETFs, like other types of funds, pull together money from investors into a basket of different investments, including stocks, bonds, and other securities. By spreading the fund's money into different securities, ETFs can generally provide investors with diversification, which can help balance risk. And because ETF shares are traded on the stock exchange, they're bought and sold like stocks, and usually incur commissions and other related fees. Just like there are a variety of mutual funds, there are a variety of different ETFs, each with different objectives. Some ETFs invest in a variety of stocks and bonds. Some replicate the performance of a stock index, like the Dow Jones Industrial Average or S&P 500. And others track the performance of a particular market sector, like technology or pharmaceuticals. However, different ETFs offer different amounts of diversification. For example, ETFs that focus more on specific sectors typically offer less diversification than those that are designed to replicate an index. Let's look at an example of investing in an ETF. Suppose an investor wants to make a diversified investment that is designed to mirror the performance of a major stock index, like the S&P 500. After researching different ETFs and finding the one he wants based on his objective, he purchases shares of it through his broker, just like you would an individual stock. Now that he owns shares, the investor has a stake in each of the fund's basket of investments, while only having to purchase one ETF. Participating in the wide market with only a single purchase, instead of multiple purchases, can save an investor research and analysis time. So how can an investor potentially achieve a positive return from the ETF? Similar to a stock, he can earn a return two ways: a rising ETF market price and dividends. Typically, if the value of the ETF's investments increases, so does its price. If our investor purchased a hypothetical ETF at $40, and a year later it was selling for $50, our investor could profit $10 per share by selling his position. Of course, if the ETF's price dropped, our investor would have lost money if the position was sold at the lower price. Because many ETFs are traded on a stock exchange, they can be bought and sold throughout the day. However, not all ETFs are widely traded, which can cause difficulty when trying to fill orders. Now, compare this to a mutual fund. Most mutual funds are only priced and traded at the end of the day. Separate from changes in price, our investor could potentially gain income if the ETF pays its investors a dividend, which is a payout of part of the fund's earnings and capital gains. Not all ETFs pay dividends. Many, instead, reinvest earnings into the fund's holdings. One of the ways to tell whether a fund pays dividends is to look at what's called its dividend yield. This yield is the amount that the fund pays out compared to the current market price of a share. ETFs have other attractive qualities. While most mutual funds require a minimum investment, which can be substantial, an ETF investor can just buy a single share plus any commissions and fees. Also, because most ETFs aren't actively managed, they typically have lower management fees than mutual funds. There is a wide variety of ETFs that attempt to track assets like corporate bonds, stocks in remote countries, commodities, and even currencies, among many other investments. While these assets carry unique risks, the ETFs that track them offer investors a practical way to analyze and potentially find opportunities in a number of markets. Want to learn more about ETFs and other investments? Continue exploring Premier Education, brought to you by TD Ameritrade.
Okay, so that just was to whet your appetite a little bit about mutual funds and ETFs. Okay, really wanted to talk more about how they work, what they are, and then we'll get into in next chapter why you might want to invest in them, and if you want to, how do you do that? How do you do that? So I mentioned at the beginning we talk about how the financial system works and also how sometimes it doesn't work. So that brings us to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Now, you all lived through this. I know you were a lot younger, probably weren't care very much about it because you were too young, but it's important that you understand what happened. What happened. In a second, I'll show you another video, just a 2-minute one, that gives a brief overview, but I wanted to give you my thoughts about what happened. They're kind of summarized here, but let me walk you through what happened that really led to the financial crisis. And I'd start by saying the seeds were sown, that's a good way to put it, with our response to the 2001 recession. Back in 2001, the economy suffered 3 real gut punches. First was the dot-com bust. Okay, the internet really got started in the mid to late 90s, and no one was quite sure what it was going to be, how it was going to work. And so companies were started, and people were investing in these companies, and the values went way up. Well, in 2000, 2001, that bubble burst for tech companies, and their values dropped by a lot. And it threw the country into a recession. So in 2001, the U.S. was in recession, largely due to the dot-com bust. Secondly, 9/11. That also happened in 2001. Gut punch number 2. And then really on top of that were all those scandals in 2002. Enron, Tyco, WorldCom. We talked about all those. So the dot-com bust, then 9/11, and then those scandals on top of it were 3 big punches to the economy. So, what did the government do to respond to those gut punches? Well, the Fed started lowering interest rates, right? We know that if you're in recession, you lower interest rates. They lowered them to 1% by June of 03. That was the lowest they've been in 45 years. So they really lowered them. There were policies to encourage home ownership. Okay, there were lots of calls that how come the rich are the ones that are taking advantage of all this? They can afford homes, but not people with more limited credit means. So there were lots of policies put in place that encouraged everyone to buy homes. There was also then deregulation. To make it easier for people to buy homes, banks and financial institutions, their reserve requirements were dropped, which simply means that how much money they had to keep on hand was lowered. They were allowed to lend a lot more money. So what happened? People bought houses in record numbers. People who had a lot of money, people who had some money, and a lot of people who had very little money. So-called subprime borrowers were buying houses because it was so easy and interest rates were so low. The home ownership rate in the U.S. went up to 70%. That was a record. So that was kind of the backdrop. It was made very easy for people to buy homes. Now, it was exacerbated by these 3 things here. And this one, risky, complex financial products, that's a key. So let me explain what these were, because it's important to understand this to understand what happened. Banks who were making these loans, instead of keeping the loans on their books, they were selling the loans to other institutions. Now think about that. If you make a loan to somebody and they're going to pay you back, you're going to make sure they're going to pay you back. But let's say you made a loan to someone and you said, I'll loan you $100 at 10% interest. You then went to somebody else and said, I'll sell you this loan. Tell you what, just pay me back, say 3% interest, and I'll sell you the loan. You can collect the other 7%. That other person says, sure, I'll do that. You then take the money and lend it out again and keep going through that process. You would be less concerned if people were going to pay you back because you were selling loans to somebody else. That's pretty much what was happening. Banks were making the loans and selling them to other institutions. These institutions were taking these loans from banks from all over the place and putting them into these big pools of loans. They were then saying, okay, here are the best loans. Some people can buy those. Here are kind of the medium loans. Some people can buy those. Here are the subprime loans. Okay, the worst credit, some people can buy those. Why would you buy a package of subprime loans? Because that's got the highest interest rate. Okay, people who had the worst credit still had to pay a higher interest rate than people with the best credit. And back then, people were thinking, boy, the home industry is going great. People are buying them left and right. People were buying those loans. So, what then happened? Well, inflation started to take place because the value of homes was going up. The value of other things were going up. Interest rates were low. Businesses and people were borrowing left and right. Inflation ensued. What does the Fed do if there's inflation? They raise interest rates. And that's what happened between 2004 and 6. Interest rates went up from about 1% to 5.25%. That's a lot. What did that mean? People started defaulting on their loans. They could afford it at 1%, but if they were taking out adjustable rate mortgages with the interest rate changed, they couldn't afford 5.25%. So people started defaulting on their loans in record numbers. So the value of homes fell because people couldn't afford them anymore. And they fell quickly. When people get scared, things fall fast. They don't fall slowly. So what happened? The housing bubble burst. Values went down quickly, and everyone who had bought these loans, they became nearly worthless because the borrowers weren't paying them back. If they weren't paying them back, there was no money to return to people. And that's essentially what happened. All these financial institutions that bought these things, they became worthless or close to worthless. And because the housing is such a huge part of our economy, think about it. When you buy a house, that's probably the most important, largest investment you're going to make. Well, that's that way for everybody. So if the housing industry falls, it just dragged down the whole economy. And as we talked about before, if the U.S. sneezes, the world catches a cold. Well, the U.S. had pneumonia. So you can imagine what that meant for the rest of the global economy. Everything started to tumble. In a nutshell, that's what happened. So, I'm going to show you a video that explains this in another way. It's important to understand it, so I thought I'd show you that as well.
The Federal Reserve staved off recession in 2001 by lowering the federal funds rate from 6.5% in May 2000 to 1.75% in December 2001. A flood of liquidity ensued, and restless borrowers with no income, job, or assets began pursuing their dream of buying a home. Banks were more than willing to help. Easy credit and increasing home prices made investments in high-yielding subprime mortgages resemble a new rush for gold. The Fed continued slashing interest rates, all the way to 1% in June 2003, the lowest in 45 years. Bankers repackaged these loans into collateralized debt obligations, then sold them to investors. The SEC relaxed net capital requirements at 5 large investment banks, freeing them to leverage their initial investments up to 30 or 40 times. Trouble appeared when interest rates started rising. Many subprime borrowers could not afford the higher rates and started defaulting. Subprime lenders began filing for bankruptcy in 2007, more than 25 during February and March alone. Financial firms and hedge funds owned more than $1 trillion in securities that were backed by failing subprime mortgages, enough to cause a global financial tsunami if the defaults continued. By August, it was clear financial markets couldn't solve the crisis, and problems spread beyond the U.S. central banks, and governments around the world began to band together to prevent further financial catastrophe. The Fed slashed the discount and funds rate, but bankruptcies and collapses persisted. Finally, the U.S. government enacted the National Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, which created $700 billion to buy distressed assets, including mortgage-backed securities. Other governments followed with their own bailout packages. The Federal Reserve.
So, pretty succinct overview again of what happened. And it's particularly important to understand that today because of what we're seeing today with coronavirus and the response to that. I mean, let's take a look at what's happened. Interest rates have been lowered to 0.25%, right? About as low as the Fed has ever had them. They're 0.25%. They've lowered the interest rate. The Fed has also increased the money supply. We know that that's what they do. That's monetary policy. And as we talked about in Chapter 1, monetary policy is the purview of the Fed. And that's why I wanted to bring up the Fed again and really talk about it a little bit more deeply because it's important with what's happening now with the coronavirus. So the Fed monetary policy is interest rates and money supply. They've lowered interest rates to 0.25%. They said they'll buy $2.3 trillion worth of securities and mortgage-backed securities. And the government, that's fiscal policy, they just passed a $2.2 trillion bill where they are going to be spending money, giving it to small business, giving it to airlines, giving it to energy companies. That's what the governments do, right? They control taxes and spending, they're spending. So just what we talked about in Chapter 1. If you want to try to juice the economy, the Fed lowers interest rates and increases the money supply, and the federal government increases spending or lowers taxes. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So, a little bit more on the Fed, okay? They're the banker's bank for those who are members of the Fed. Do all banks have to belong to the Fed? They don't, but just like with FDIC insurance, virtually all banks do. Virtually all banks have FDIC insurance. Virtually all banks belong to the Fed. Okay, if you have a federal charter, you have to belong. That's almost all banks. But again, it's not a requirement. Not a requirement. And the Fed has three major goals. Okay, those you see. They want stable prices, full employment, and sustainable economic growth. If you have those three things, the economy is going to be in good shape, right? So, how's the Fed doing? Well, let's take a look. Price stability. The target inflation rate, remember what that is? Where they'd love to see inflation? 2%. That's the target inflation rate. And what is it today? Well, before coronavirus, it was at 2.3%, pretty good. The most recent reading, it's down to 1.5%. Not a surprise. Not a surprise. Who's going to raise prices in this atmosphere? Full employment. Well, we know that full employment is 95% of people working. Where was it before coronavirus? 3.5% unemployment. That was the lowest in 50 years. But now, with the coronavirus, what's happening? Well, the latest reading was 4.4%, and it's very likely to hit double digits. Very likely to hit double digits. And then finally, sustainable economic growth. We talked about 2 to 3% being ideal GDP growth. What is it today? Well, it was 2.1%. Very good. But it is likely to be negative, right? With what's happening with coronavirus. Are we likely to go into a recession? Well, we recall that a recession is what? 2 straight quarters of negative GDP. Well, it's very likely that January, February, March, the first quarter of this year, is going to be lower than the last 3 months of last year, right? Pretty likely. Numbers aren't in yet. And then it'll be even more likely that April, May, June, the second 3 months of this year, will be lower than January, February, March. So it's very likely that we're in a recession right now. You won't know for sure till those numbers are in, but in all likelihood, we entered a recession in January. We're likely in a period of at least 2 straight quarters of negative GDP growth. So if that's the role of the Fed, let's talk about how the Fed is organized. There's 12 districts across the United States. They each have their own bank. So there's one in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Richmond, Atlanta, St. Louis, Dallas, San Francisco. There's 12 of these. 2 main groups of the Fed. One, the Board of Governors. That's their governing body. Okay? All 7 members are nominated by the U.S. President, confirmed by the Senate. 14-year terms. Why so long? Why are their terms so long? Well, they want these people to be free from political pressure. And if you have a 14-year term, you know you're there that long, then you can be free from whatever politicians say because you're there for 14 years. The chair and the vice chair serve every 4 years. That way, every president gets to appoint their own chair. That's why that's set up that way. And who's the chair today? Jerome Powell. That's the name of the chair today. And then finally, the Federal Open Markets Committee. That consists of 12 members, the Board of Governors, plus 5 others. That's really the group that sets monetary policy. Now, we talked about monetary policy is the money supply and interest rates, but how does that actually work? What tools do they use? And for that, we're going to take a look at our last slide of the day. Last slide of the day. The tools the Fed uses to make that happen. Well, 3 main tools. The first, reserve requirements. As we said earlier, banks have to keep a certain amount of money in storage. They cannot lend it out. And today, that's 10% for large banks. So banks can only lend out 90% of their deposits. They have to keep 10%. If the Fed wants to, they can change that amount. If they say lowered it to 5%, that would be more money that banks could lend out. The Fed rarely changes that, but that's something they could do. They could lower their reserve requirements to give banks more money to lend. One thing they could do. Another thing they do, and this is used quite often, open market operations. And that's just buying and selling securities. That's how the Fed increases the money supply or decreases the money supply. Okay, when you wonder, all right, how do you increase the money supply? What do? Well, they don't just send money to banks. That's not what they do. If they want to increase it, they buy securities that are already out there. Because if you buy something, what do? You give money to someone for a product, right? The Fed is doing the same thing. Securities are on the market. They're buying them, which means they're putting money out into the system to buy these things. So if they want to increase the money supply, they buy securities. And if they want to decrease it, they're going to sell securities. Because when you sell securities, you're taking money in. You're taking money in. So today, given the coronavirus, the Fed is buying securities. They're putting money out there because they want more money in circulation. Finally, the discount rate. That's the last policy tool we're going to talk about today, and that's just moving interest rates up and down. The discount rate is the rate that the Fed loans banks, and the banks just pass that on to their customers. That's how that works. Well, you might ask, why do banks have to borrow money in the first place? They're banks. Why do they need to borrow? Well, the answer is they have to keep those reserves we talked about initially. And if they get below that 10%, and that's possible because, someone could prepay a loan early, need additional loans, who knows? If you get a little below 10, then they have to borrow to make sure they're at that 10% number. And so the Fed sets the discount rate. And then whatever the banks are paying, they will then pass that on to customers and charge customers a little bit more so they can make money. So that's the third policy tool that the Fed uses. So with that, that's really a bit more of a discussion on the Fed. Okay, given their importance in the environment today, wanted to go over that. As always, if you have questions on anything, feel free to send me an email. Okay? On Wednesday, we're going to talk a little bit more about stocks and bonds and money market instruments, securities that are traded on financial exchanges, and how that works. This was just kind of an introduction of the system as a whole. So again, with that, stay safe, everyone. Take care, and we'll be in touch again on Wednesday.